Bangkok, 1972. Los Angeles International Airport, September 1972. Gate 14, Pan Am Flight 811, bound for Tokyo. The boarding was routine. The manifest was ordinary. Nobody in that terminal had any reason to believe that the next 6 hours would produce a story so extraordinary that the people who lived it would spend the rest of their lives deciding whether to tell it. 2 men were on that flight who should not, by any ordinary logic of scheduling and coincidence, have been on the same aircraft. One of them was the most famous martial artist on Earth. The other was the most famous athlete on Earth. And somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, at 37,000 feet, in a pressurized aluminum tube with no exits and no audience except the terrified passengers around them, something happened that neither man ever discussed publicly, that no journalist ever fully verified, and that has lived for 50 years in the gray territory between rumor and history. This is the story of what the passengers said they saw, and what 2 legends never denied. To understand what happened on that plane, you have to understand who these 2 men were to each other and to the world in 1972. Bruce Lee was 31 years old. The Big Boss had detonated across Asian cinema the previous year like nothing the industry had ever seen. Fist of Fury followed, and the numbers were obscene. Box office records shattered in Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, theaters playing continuous showings around the clock to crowds that lined up before dawn. He was in post-production on Way of the Dragon, which he had written, directed, produced, and starred in. The first Chinese filmmaker to do all 4 simultaneously for a major martial arts production. Hollywood was circling, carefully, the way you circle something you want but don't quite know how to hold. In America, he was still the man from the Green Hornet to most people, Kato, the sidekick, the chauffeur who outfought everyone in every episode while the lead took the credit. The industry had decided, quietly, in rooms Bruce Lee was never invited into, that an Asian man couldn't carry an American film. They told him to his face, with a particular corporate politeness that makes humiliation sound like advice. He was on his way to Tokyo for a production meeting, traveling alone, no entourage, just a carry-on bag and the contained, kinetic stillness that everyone who met him in person described as the quality that struck them first. The feeling that all his energy was perpetually present, but perpetually held, like a coiled spring that has chosen not to release. Muhammad Ali was 30 years old. He had just come off one of the most complex periods of any athlete's life, the years of exile following his refusal to be inducted into the Vietnam War, the stripping of his title, the legal battles, the comeback, the stunning loss to Frazier in the fight of the century, and then the grinding work of rebuilding. He had fought 23 times since his return. He was scheduled to fight Bob Foster for the light heavyweight championship in November. He was also, and this is the part that matters for what happened, obsessed with Bruce Lee. Not secretly, openly. Ali had seen the Big Boss at a screening in New York and had reportedly walked out saying, "That's the fastest human being I have ever seen, and I've been in the ring with everyone." He had studied the film, watched the fight sequences repeatedly, started asking people in his circle, "Can anyone get me a meeting with this man?" He was traveling to Tokyo for a promotional commitment, a series of exhibition appearances being organized by Japanese promoters who were in the early conversations about what would eventually become the Thriller in Manila planning circuit. He had a small entourage, a trainer, an assistant, and 2 associates from his management company. Neither man knew the other was on the flight. That's the detail that matters. This was not arranged, not planned, not a publicity stunt in its origin. The manifest was a coincidence, if you believe in coincidence, or fate, if you don't. They discovered each other somewhere over the first 2 hours of the flight. The account that survives comes primarily from 3 sources. A passenger named Elaine Takuda, a Japanese-American academic traveling to Osaka, who happened to be seated 4 rows behind where Bruce Lee was sitting. A flight attendant identified in various tellings only as Patricia or Pat, and a retired sports journalist named Gerald Moran, who was on the flight covering Ali's Tokyo promotional tour and who wrote about what he witnessed in a 1989 memoir that received almost no attention outside combat sports circles. All 3 accounts agree on the essential sequence of events. They disagree on tone, on specific dialogue, on which man spoke first. They agree completely on what happened when the man in C-24C stood up.
The first 2 hours were uneventful. Ali's presence on the aircraft had been noted by essentially every passenger within 10 rows of his seat within the first 20 minutes of boarding. He was, in person, in a confined space, an almost impossible presence to ignore. 6 feet 3 inches, 215 pounds of perfectly organized mass. A face so precisely beautiful that strangers stared at it the way they stare at architecture. He laughed loudly, talked to everyone around him, signed 3 autographs before the plane reached cruising altitude, and at one point stood in the aisle to demonstrate a combination to his trainer that made 2 flight attendants stop walking and watch. Bruce Lee, 4 rows ahead and across the aisle, had been reading since takeoff. He was aware of Ali. Elaine Takuda, who could see both men from her position, would later write that she watched Lee glance over his shoulder toward the commotion Ali was generating. Once, briefly, with an expression she described as quiet assessment, the way a test player looks at a board. Then he went back to his book. Ali found him first. Exactly how it happened depends on which account you read. Moran wrote that Ali's trainer spotted Lee and recognized him from the Green Hornet, told Ali, who immediately unfastened his seatbelt and walked forward through the cabin. Takuda's account has Ali standing to stretch and simply seeing Lee from the aisle, stopping, doing a visible double-take. Either way, the result was the same. Muhammad Ali materialized beside Bruce Lee's seat, looked down at the compact figure reading a book, and said, and this is the one line that all 3 accounts reproduce identically, "You're that KO guy." Bruce Lee looked up. He took a moment. Then he said, "And you're the boxer." Ali laughed, the big, room-filling laugh that was as famous as his left jab. He dropped into the empty seat beside Lee without asking, the way a man who has never been refused anything doesn't ask. "I've been trying to meet you," Ali said. "I saw your movie." "Which one?" "The one with the fighter at the end, Ice Factory or something." "The Big Boss," Lee said. Yeah, I watched it 4 times. Ali paused. "You're fast." Another pause from Lee. "So I've been told," he said. What followed, by all accounts, was one of the more extraordinary conversations to take place at 37,000 feet in the 20th century. 2 hours, maybe 2.5. Moran, who could hear fragments from 3 rows back and later filled in details from a brief conversation with Ali's trainer, described it as a mutual interrogation conducted with deep mutual respect by 2 men who recognized in each other something they didn't find often. They talked about speed. Ali's thesis, which he had developed and refined and could articulate with surprising precision, was that speed in boxing was misunderstood. People thought it was about how fast your hands moved. It wasn't. It was about how fast you decided. The hands were downstream of the decision. Train the decision, and the hands followed. Lee leaned forward when Ali said this. "That's exactly right," he said. "The strike is finished before it begins." Ali pointed at him. Yes, that's what I'm talking about." They talked about size. Ali, who had spent his career being told he was too small for heavyweight, too pretty, too fast, not powerful enough, had a philosophy about size that mapped almost perfectly onto Lee's. Size was a default strategy, Ali said. The thing you relied on when you hadn't developed anything better. The big man swings big. The skilled man doesn't let the big man swing. They talked about fear. Lee asked Ali about the Frazier fight, directly, without the social padding that most people wrapped such questions in. Ali went quiet for a moment. Then talked for 10 minutes about what it felt like to be knocked down by a left hook in front of 20,000 people and have to decide in the 3 seconds you're on the canvas whether you're still the person you thought you were. Lee listened without interrupting. When Ali finished, Lee said, "The man who falls and gets up is more dangerous than the man who never fell." Ali looked at him for a long moment. "I'm going to use that," he said. "It isn't mine," Lee said. "I don't think it belongs to anyone." The flight was 4 hours from Los Angeles to Tokyo, actually closer to 11 due to the routing, and they were somewhere over the mid-Pacific, roughly 5 hours in, when the quality of the air inside the aircraft changed. It began at the back. A raised voice. Then silence. Then another raised voice.
different pitch, different register. The kind of sounds that in an enclosed space produce an immediate and specific kind of alertness in every conscious nervous system present. Then a flight attendant walked quickly toward the front of the plane. Not running. The trained fast walk of airline personnel who have been taught that running creates panic. Her face, as she passed Elaine Takuta's row, was the color of paper. 3 rows back, Gerald Moran put down his drink. Up near the front, Bruce Lee and Muhammad Ali stopped talking.
The camp went quiet. The man in seat 24C had been quiet since boarding. Middle-aged, heavy-set, traveling alone. He had drunk 3 whiskeys in the first 2 hours, which the flight attendant had noted but not yet acted on. He had become progressively agitated as the flight continued, talking to himself in low tones, gripping the armrests, pressing his face periodically against the window at the darkness outside. At 5 hours into the flight, he stood up. He was holding something. The passengers near him saw it first. The ripple of reaction moved forward through the cabin, the way fear moves, silently, swiftly, each row turning as the information arrived at them. A bottle, green glass, broken at the neck, held by the intact base, the jagged edge forward. He was not a trained man. He was not organized. He was a frightened, drunk, unraveling man with a broken bottle in a confined space at 37,000 feet, which in its own way made him more dangerous than a trained man. Trained men have calculations. He had only the raw, thermite-hot energy of a person who has decided that the ordinary rules of the world no longer applied to him. He was shouting now. The words were not fully coherent. Something about the plane, about turning around, about a destination, about a name that nobody in earshot could identify. The flight attendant near him had backed against the bulkhead. 2 passengers in adjacent seats had flattened themselves against the far side of their seats, pressing into the windows. The aisle between seat 24C and the front of the plane was approximately 40 feet of thin blue carpet. At the front, Bruce Lee stood up. He did it quietly, without announcement. The way you stand up to retrieve something from an overhead bin. A movement so ordinary that for a half-second nobody around him registered that anything had changed. Muhammad Ali's hand came out and caught his arm. "Wait," Ali said. Lee looked at him. Ali's face was completely serious. The fight face, stripped of the performance and the theater, the face underneath the face. His eyes were doing exactly what he described 2 hours earlier, deciding fast. "How are you going to do it?" Ali asked. Quiet, direct, not a challenge. A genuine tactical question from one professional to another. Lee looked down the aisle. Looked back at Ali. "He won't see me coming," Lee said. 3 seconds of silence. Ali released his arm. "Go," Ali said.
Crew Prasong was in the ring before either fighter. That was the first thing Elaine Takota noticed from her seat, and she would describe it in detail decades later, in the careful, precise language of someone who has replayed a memory so many times it has become almost tactile. He didn't rush, didn't crouch into a combat posture, didn't announce himself with any of the physical vocabulary that people associated with confrontation, the squared shoulders, the raised hands, the forward lean of a body preparing for impact. He walked. Normally, calmly, the way a man walks to the galley for a glass of water. But there was something in the quality of the walk, something in the complete absence of hesitation, in the way his feet placed themselves with a quietness that didn't match the thin carpet and the recycled cabin air, that made every passenger he passed go very still. Gerald Moran, watching from 3 rows back, wrote later, "I have covered 40 years of prize fighting. I have sat ringside for some of the most dangerous men who ever laced up gloves. I have never felt what I felt watching that man walk down that aisle. It was not aggression. It was something quieter than aggression and more absolute." The man in 24C was still shouting. He had not yet seen Bruce Lee moving toward him. He was focused on the flight attendant pinned against the bulkhead, the broken bottle held forward, his body swaying slightly with the combination of altitude and alcohol and whatever private catastrophe had brought him to this moment. The words were still not fully coherent, a tangle of grievance and desperation, and the specific incoherence of a mind that has pushed past the point where reason can organize language. 30 feet. 25. The passengers in the rows between Lee and the man were doing one of two things, pressing themselves into their seats and looking away,
or pressing themselves into their seats and watching with the fixed, helpless attention of people who cannot look away from something they know they will carry for the rest of their lives. 20 feet. The man turned. He saw Bruce Lee. What he saw was, and this is the challenge that all three witnesses faced when trying to describe it, not threatening. That was the word Dakota used, not threatening. She meant it as the highest possible description of what she observed, though she understood that on its face it sounded like the opposite. Lee had stopped walking. He stood in the aisle, roughly 15 feet from the man, and he was standing, just standing, weight slightly forward, arms loose at his sides, head level. His face held no aggression, no performance of bravery, no attempt to project dominance. He looked at the man the way you looked at someone you were trying to help find their way. The shouting dropped in volume, not stopped, dropped. The man's rhythm had been disrupted by something he couldn't name, the absence of the fear response he had been generating from everyone else in the cabin. He had been feeding on that fear, on the wide eyes and the pressed bodies and the backed-away flight attendant. It was confirming something he needed confirmed. Bruce Lee's face confirmed nothing. It simply looked at him. The man said something, addressed directly at Lee now, a challenge, a warning. He jabbed the broken bottle forward once, a short, aggressive gesture meant to establish distance and intent. Lee didn't move. "Put it down," Lee said. His voice was not loud. It was not soft. It was at conversation volume, the volume you'd use talking to someone across a dinner table, and in the pressurized silence of the cabin it carried to every row. The man said something back, louder. The bottle jabbed forward again, twice this time. Lee took one step forward, just one. Slow, deliberate. The man's free hand came up, a stop gesture, palm forward, the universal human signal meaning, "Do not come closer." Lee stopped. "I'm not going to hurt you," Lee said. Still that same dinner table voice. "No one here is going to hurt you, but you need to put it down." A long moment. The cabin was so quiet that Moran, from 6 rows back, could hear the ambient hum of the engines as a physical thing, a vibration in the seat beneath him. The man was breathing hard. His eyes moved, from Lee to the bottle in his own hand, to Lee again. Something was happening in him that the alcohol and the fear were making difficult to process. He had prepared, in whatever dark internal staging of this moment he had rehearsed, for a certain kind of response. Authorities, uniforms, men who approached with the language and posture of institutional force. He had not prepared for this, for a lean man in a plain shirt who walked slowly and spoke quietly and looked at him like a person rather than a problem. It was destabilizing in a way that force would not have been. Force he could answer. Force had a logic he understood. This had no logic he could find the edge of. "I don't want," the man started. "I know," Lee said, before the sentence finished, as if he already knew what was in it, as if the words were less important than the thing behind the words, and the thing behind the words he had already understood. Another long moment. What happened in the next 12 seconds divided itself in Elaine Dakota's memory into something that felt both very fast and very slow, the quality that extreme moments have of existing outside ordinary time. The man lunged, not toward Lee specifically. It was less directed than that, more the eruption of all the compressed and formless energy in his body finding a sudden exit. He came forward and to the left, the bottle swinging in a wide arc, a movement that in its speed and chaos would have been genuinely dangerous to most people in its path. Most people were not standing where Bruce Lee was standing. The arc of the bottle passed through space that Bruce Lee had already vacated. He moved right, a displacement of maybe 10 inches, the smallest possible geometry of avoidance, and his left hand came up not to block but to redirect, finding the man's wrist at the apex of the swing and turning it, following the momentum rather than opposing it, a circular motion that used the energy of the lunge itself to continue and complete and redirect. The bottle left the man's hand. It didn't fly. It didn't shatter dramatically against anything. It simply transferred from the man's grip to the floor, a distance of 3 feet, landing with a flat sound that was almost anticlimactic given everything that had preceded it. The man's own momentum carried him forward and slightly down. Lee's right hand was there, not striking, not restraining with force, but guiding, a firm contact at the shoulder that redirected the forward energy into a controlled descent. The man ended up in the nearest empty seat, row 23, window side, with a completeness and a gentleness that made it look, from certain angles, like he had simply decided to sit down. He sat there, breathing. The broken bottle lay on the carpet 3 feet away. A flight attendant was moving quickly from the front now, a second one behind her. Moran was on his feet. 3 passengers near the back had stood up without knowing why. Bruce Lee stepped back. He looked at the man in seat 23 for a moment. The same look from before, direct and without judgment. The look that contained something the man would presumably carry with him for a long time. Then he turned and walked back up the aisle. He did not look around at the cabin, did not acknowledge the stairs, did not slow his pace or quicken it. He walked back to his seat. He sat down. He picked up his book. Aftermath at 37,000 feet. The cabin took approximately 30 seconds to remember how to breathe. Then it erupted. Not in cheering, in the release of 5 hours of accumulated tension finding a sudden and complete exit. People talking, some crying, a woman 2 rows behind Dakota laughing in the helpless, involuntary way of a person whose nervous system has nothing more organized to offer. The man from 24C was being attended to by the flight attendants. He was not combative. He was not unconscious. He was deflated. The word Moran used was hollow, like something essential had gone out of him when the bottle left his hand. He sat where Lee had placed him and answered questions in a flat, quiet voice, and did not look at anyone directly. In seat 7A, Muhammad Ali had not moved. He had watched the entire sequence from his seat, turned sideways, one massive forearm resting on the back of the seat in front of him, watching with the focused attention of a man evaluating something he intends to understand completely. When Lee sat back down, Ali was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, 12 seconds. Lee looked at him. Start to finish, Ali said. I counted. Lee said nothing. You didn't hit him, Ali said. It was not a question. It was the observation of someone working something out. He didn't need to be hit, Lee said. Ali sat with that. Most men, Ali said slowly, would have hit him. First chance. All that adrenaline, you want to use it somewhere. The adrenaline is the problem, Lee said, not the solution. Another silence. Outside the windows, the Pacific darkness was absolute. No horizon, no reference point, just the thin skin of the aircraft and the black immensity beyond it. How did you know he'd lunge? Ali asked. I didn't, Lee said. Then how? I didn't need to know, Lee said. Whatever he did, there was an answer. The answer changes depending on what he does. I didn't decide in advance. He paused. You know this. You do this every time you fight. Ali was quiet again. Then, slowly, he began to nod. The nod of a man recognizing something he knew but had not articulated. Present, Ali said. Present, Lee confirmed. They didn't speak for a while after that. Moran, who had gotten close enough during the aftermath confusion to hear fragments, would write that the silence between the two men was not the silence of people who had run out of things to say. It was the silence of two people who had arrived at the same place from different directions, and were simply sitting with the fact of it. Ali spoke again.
The remaining hours of the flight passed quietly. The man from 24C was moved to a crew rest area and remained there until landing. The captain made no announcement, a decision that the passengers in the rear half of the aircraft, who had seen or heard nothing, would only understand days later when fragments of the story began to circulate through Tokyo's expatriate and press communities. At some point, Takuda estimated around 2 hours before landing, Ali fell asleep. The big frame arranged itself in the economy-class seat with the resigned geometry of a very tall man who has spent decades in vehicles that were not designed for him, head against the window, arms crossed, breathing slow and deep. Bruce Lee did not sleep. He read, made occasional notes in the margin of whatever he was reading, a habit several people who knew him described, the constant dialogue he maintained with whatever text was in his hands. At one point, he looked out the window for a long time at the darkness over the Pacific. Takuda, watching from her seat, would describe that image as the one she returned to most often in the years after, not the confrontation in the aisle, not the extraordinary conversation she had eavesdropped on for 2 hours. This, a lean man in a white shirt, looking out at darkness, utterly still, thinking something she could not read and that he did not share. What was he thinking? Nobody knows. It's one of the questions that the story leaves permanently open, which may be part of why the story has lasted. Gray light, ground fog, the long procedural unwinding of an international arrival, the gate, the jetway, the terminal with its particular smell of floor cleaner and recycled air, and the specific exhaustion of people who have crossed an ocean overnight. Ali and Lee walked through the terminal together for a short distance. Ali's entourage surrounded him quickly, trainers, the assistant, the management associates, immediately reconstructing the working apparatus of a world-famous athlete arriving in a foreign city. At a junction in the terminal, a branching of corridors where one direction led to customs for Japanese citizens and the other for foreign nationals, they stopped. Ali extended his hand. Lee shook it. Come to one of my training sessions while you're in Tokyo, Ali said. I want to show you something. What? Lee asked. How I throw the jab, Ali said. I want to see what you see when you watch it. A beat. All right, Lee said. Ali smiled, the full smile, the famous one, the one that contained the showmanship and the warmth and the absolute confidence all at once. Then he turned and disappeared into the crowd of his entourage and the thickening foot traffic of the terminal. Bruce Lee stood at the junction for a moment. Then he walked toward customs. Gerald Moran, 20 feet behind, watched him go, compact, unhurried, carrying his single bag, and disappeared into the crowd. He stood there for a moment himself, in the gray Tokyo morning, holding his reporter's notebook. He did not write anything in it. Some things, he would explain in his 1989 memoir, you put in a notebook, and some things you carry differently. The rumors began within 48 hours. Tokyo's martial arts and entertainment press communities were small and interconnected in ways that American journalists didn't fully understand. Word moved through them like electricity through a closed circuit. A flight attendant told someone told someone. By the end of the week,
3 different versions of the story were circulating, each one more dramatic than the last. In one version, the man had a knife. In another, there had been 2 men. In a third, and this version developed its own persistent life, Ali and Lee had fought each other on the plane, a spontaneous exhibition in the rear galley, with the hijacking attempt as the framing device that conveniently explained why they were both standing in the aisle. That last version was the most viral, in the pre-internet meaning of the word. It spread through gyms and dojos and film sets across Asia, and eventually back to America, the story of the 2 greatest fighters alive, locked in a contest at altitude, witnessed by passengers who couldn't agree on what they'd seen. It was not what happened, but it contained something that made people want it to be true. The idea that those 2 men in that space could not have not tested each other, that proximity and mutual recognition and the pure competitive electricity that both of them generated would have inevitably produced something physical. The real story was stranger than that, more interesting than that. 2 men recognized each other completely, as practitioners, as philosophers, as people who had arrived at similar truths through entirely different paths, and expressed that recognition through conversation, through silence, and through the shared witness of a moment that required exactly what both of them had spent their lives developing. No competition, no exhibition, no hierarchy established, just 2 people at 37,000 feet, being exactly who they were. Neither man confirmed or denied the story publicly. Ali, when asked about it directly in a 1974 interview, smiled and said, "I've been on a lot of planes." Bruce Lee died in July 1973. He was 32 years old. He never commented on it. The 3 witnesses, Takuda, Moran, and the flight attendant known only as Patricia, gave their accounts at different times, in different contexts, to different audiences. The accounts agree in their architecture and diverge in their details, the way genuine memory always works. Not the perfect agreement of fabricated testimony, but the honest inconsistency of real human beings trying to describe a true thing. No recording exists. The passenger manifest from Pan Am Flight 811, September 1972, has never been located in publicly available archives. The story lives where most important stories live, in the territory between what can be proven and what cannot be disproven, kept alive by the quality of the telling and the sense which the people who've heard it can never fully shake, that it sounds true. Not in the way a manufactured story sounds true, polished, convenient, too perfectly shaped. In the other way, the way a real thing sounds true, uneven, incomplete, with the gaps and silences that reality always leaves behind, because reality doesn't edit for negative satisfaction. There is a moment in every genuine encounter between 2 extraordinary people where the measurement stops, where the question of who was better becomes not just unanswerable but irrelevant, dissolved by the recognition of something they share that is more interesting than any contest could resolve. Bruce Lee and Muhammad Ali were in 1972 the 2 most complete physical intelligences on the planet. Between them they had developed, through entirely different traditions, entirely different cultures, entirely different physical languages, the same core understanding. That the body's highest capability is not destruction, it is precision. The precise application of exactly the right amount of force in exactly the right direction at exactly the right moment, not a gram more, not a fraction of a second late, not a degree off in any direction. Ali called it triming, Lee called it interception. Different words, same country. And at 37,000 feet over the Pacific, when a frightened man with a broken bottle made ordinary physics dangerous, it was Lee who stood up and demonstrated, not for an audience, not for her record, not for the mythology that would eventually attach itself to the moment, but because the situation required exactly what he had. He brought exactly that, nothing more. The bottle landed on the carpet. The man sat down. Lee walked back to his seat and picked up his book. No performance, no ceremony, no acknowledgement that anything extraordinary had occurred. That is the philosophy, not the words in the notebooks, not the interviews, not the 1-inch punch demonstrations or the 2-finger push-ups, or the speed that cameras couldn't catch. The philosophy was, be so completely what you are, that when the moment arrives, there is no gap between the situation and your response. No hesitation, no performance, no excess, just the right answer, delivered completely, and then, return to reading. Muhammad Ali understood this. He had been living his own version of it his entire life, the refusal to be anything other than exactly what he was, regardless of what the world demanded him become, regardless of the cost. Draft board, boxing commission, public opinion, the weight of his own legend. He moved through all of it the way Lee moved through that aisle, without apology, without performance, present to the actual situation rather than the story being told about it. 2 men found each other at altitude and recognized each other the way mirrors recognize each other, each one showing the other something they could not see from their own position. That is the story. Not the hijacking, not the confrontation, not the 12 seconds in the aisle, the conversation. The silence after the conversation. The nod of recognition between 2 people who have arrived, by completely different roads, at the same understanding of what it means to be completely alive in a single moment. Bruce Lee lived 32 years. In those 32 years, he rewrote what people believed a human body could do. He dismantled the walls between cultures and traditions and disciplines. He built a philosophy from scratch, not from books, not from inheritance, but from the raw and relentless examination of his own body and mind and the nature of movement and truth. And on a September night in 1972, somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, with no audience and no camera and no legacy in mind, he walked down an airplane aisle and solved a problem with the minimum possible force, guided a frightened man into a chair like helping someone find their seat, and returned to his book. The world didn't see it. 3 people did. 3 people, and the most famous athlete alive, who counted the seconds and sat in silence afterward, and understood that he had just watched someone live exactly the way they had decided to live. 12 seconds. An entire philosophy. The flight landed. The fog burned off. Tokyo went about its business. 2 legends walked out of an airport into a gray morning and disappeared into their separate trajectories. Lee toward Gallon that will never be completed. Ali toward a legacy that would outlast every ring he ever stood in. They never saw each other again. But Ali, in interviews across the decades that followed, would occasionally say something that journalists would write down and fans would quote without always knowing where it came from, a phrase that didn't sound like Ali's usual register, that carried a different cadence, a different weight. The strike is finished before it begins. He never explained where he'd heard it. He never needed to. If this story moved something in you, if you felt the truth in it, even where the records run out, subscribe, hit the bell, because the most important moments in history are the ones that happened when no one was filming, the ones that survived only because the people who were there chose to remember. We'll keep finding it.